Good morning, everybody. It is so good to see you all this morning. We're in week 2 of our series entitled Unlikely Disciple, and here over the course of this month, we're going to take some time and we're going to look at the disciple Peter. I'm guessing that if you looked at any of the disciples, you'd probably look at them and kind of say, I don't know if any of them were actually likely, like there wasn't anything about any of them that would say this is somebody that Jesus is going to call, but instead it kind of see what we see in ourselves, that Jesus just finds people that are willing and goes with that. But whenever you look at Peter, the reason that Peter is known as the unlikely disciple is because Peter experienced some really high highs, and he also experienced some really low lows, and it's probably this reason that whenever we look at the disciples today and whenever we try to think, is there a disciple that we might relate to a little bit more than others, probably the majority of us would say, I relate with Peter because I understand what it is to have really high highs and to have really low lows. You have to remember, it was Peter who in Matthew chapter 16, Jesus gathered his disciples around and he asked this question, so who do people say that I am? And it was Peter who ultimately, stepped up and spoke for the group whenever he said, well, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah, you are the Son of the living God. And Jesus looked at Peter and said that this wasn't revealed to you by man, but this was revealed to you by your Father in heaven. And on this rock, like Peter being the rock and this statement being the rock, on this rock I will build my church and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. That's a pretty high, right? Well, then you have just a few verses later where Jesus goes ahead and tells his disciples that he's going to be betrayed and he's going to die. And Peter kind of, interjects himself once again and says, no, Jesus, that's not going to happen. Not on my watch. I won't let that happen. And Jesus goes from saying, on this rock, I'm going to build my church, to all of a sudden saying to Peter, get behind me, Satan. That's quite a stark difference, and the two messages that Peter received. But that's kind of Peter's life. We talked about this one last week, how during a storm, Jesus came out walking on the water to the disciples as they were terrified in the middle of this massive storm. And Peter sees Jesus walking towards him on the water. And so Peter decides, wow, that looks really cool or really fun or something. So he asks the question. He doesn't ask, Jesus, help us to get to the other side safely. He doesn't ask for the storm to stop. He asks this question, Jesus, if it's really you, can I walk on water too? And Jesus says, sure, come on. And Peter hops out of the boat and he literally walks on water. But then he begins to notice and the waves around him, the storm that was raging around him, and he takes his eyes off Jesus and he begins to sink. But as he's sinking, he cries out for Jesus to save him. And before he was even completely submerged, I believe that Jesus takes his hand and pulls him out of the water and pulls him back on top of the water and looks at him with a little smile and says, oh, you of little faith. And then Jesus and Peter, they walk back to the boat on the water. And Peter learned that the object of your faith is always greater than the size of your faith. And because of that, you of little faith can be one of great faith when your faith is placed in Jesus. But today we're going to look at a time in Peter's life that I'm guessing he would probably like to have back. Like if he could hit that rewind button, if he could have that do-over, like this would probably be the place where he would want it. Peter understood failure and regret. And I'm guessing today that many of us in this room understand failure and regret. I know I do. This is my 22nd year in full-time ministry, and I tell people this all the time, but if you would have asked me 23 years ago, Andy, what kind of pastor are you going to be? I would have told you, I'm going to be the world's best pastor. And many of you are laughing because you know how far that is from the truth. I get it. But I would have said, I'm going to be the world's best pastor. But instead, here's kind of what's happened. I've been a part of a church split. Like played a role that I should not have played. Was prideful whenever I should have been humble. I've been a part of a church split. I've been let go from a church. I've One of my mentors, he gave me this piece of advice whenever I was going through some tense times at a church. He said, choose choose your battles. And essentially he said, pick the hill that you want to die on. Choose the hill you want to die on. And I've chosen some really silly hills to die on. This past week, Heather and I, we celebrated our 19th wedding anniversary, which is incredible. Yeah. Thank you. I've put up with a lot over the last 19 years. But if you would ask me 19 and a half years ago, like, Andy, what kind of husband are you going to be? I would have told you that I'm going to be the world's best husband. But instead, there have been many times that through my marriage, I've learned just how self-centered I really am, how selfish I really am. I've failed far, far too many times to love my wife as Christ loves the church. I've on multiple occasions chosen silly hills to die on. I have a 16-year-old. I have a 13-year-old. I have an 8-year-old. And I have a 3-year-old. And if you would ask me 16 and a half years ago, Andy, what kind of parent are you going to be? I would have told you. I'm going to be the world's best parent. The world's best dad. But wouldn't you know it, that self-centeredness stuff, it shows up in my parenting too. I've made promises that I haven't kept. I've been too lenient at times and too strict at others. I've chosen silly hills to die on. And no matter how often I fail, it never gets easier. I may ultimately become numb to the failure and numb to the pain, but the regret just continues to get heavier and heavier. And I'm guessing I'm not alone in this. And the reason I'm guessing that I'm not alone in this is because we all fail. No one is exempt from failure. And so the question is not, will we fail? The question is, how will we respond to our failure? Will we grow? Or will we quit? You see, throughout the Gospels, Jesus had hundreds of followers, but out of the hundreds of followers, he had these 12 guys that he spent day in and day out with. And out of the 12, he had these 3 guys that literally went everywhere with him. And Peter, the guy that we're talking about this month, he was one of the 3. Along with James and John, they got to see more healings and experience more miraculous signs than literally anyone else. And so on that final night of Jesus' life, the night that Jesus was ultimately betrayed, he once again gathered around with the 12, gathered around this table in the upper room with his followers. And over the course of the evening, he would get up from his spot, he would take off his outer robe, he would tie it around his waist, and he would go around and wash his disciples' feet. And he would tell them that I have set an example for you that you should do as I have done for you. He would teach them about discipleship and what it looked like to live the life that he desired for them to live. He would tell them about the importance of staying connected to him. He would talk to them and share a meal with them, and he would establish the Lord's Supper for them through that meal. And at this point, by the time they got to the upper room, Jesus had already predicted his death on a number of occasions. But his disciples still didn't really understand what he was talking about. But then over the course of the evening, as they're sitting around this table, Jesus, he makes a couple of more predictions. First, he predicted that one of his disciples who was around the table with them would ultimately betray him that night. Of course, we know that he was talking about Judas, But you can feel the weight in the room as Jesus says, one of you are going to betray me. All of the disciples begin to look to their right and their left. Like, is it you? Is it you? It's definitely not going to be me. But then Jesus also made this statement. He said that all of you will fall away on account of me. Like tonight, all of you will fall away on account of me. And again, you have Peter, as all the disciples are trying to figure out, what is he saying? I'm not going anywhere, but Peter was not one who did a good job of allowing his thoughts to stay in his head. Instead, his thoughts often just came sprinting out of his mouth. And so as the other disciples are trying to figure out what Jesus is talking about, Peter just says, no, Jesus, not me. I will never abandon you. I will never leave you. I will never deny you. Even if I must die, I will not leave. And then Jesus, he looks at Peter and he says this response that we've heard so many times. He tells Peter that before the rooster crows early in the morning, you will have denied me 3 times. And as the night went on, Jesus leaves the upper room to go pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he takes his 3 closest followers with him, James, John, and Peter. And Jesus tells them to keep watch as he goes off into the distance to pray, and he goes off to pray, but every time he comes back, he doesn't find the disciples keeping watch. He finds them sleeping instead. And eventually, Jesus comes face to face with Judas, and he is betrayed with a kiss. He's arrested. He's put before a series of legal trials that are nothing short of a mockery. And as all of this is taking place, as all of this is going on, Peter is following at a distance. And as he's following, somebody recognizes him as being a follower of Jesus. But Peter denies it. He goes a little bit further and he finds another person who says that he has been with Jesus. And again, he denies it. And then early in the morning, Peter is standing around a charcoal fire whenever a young girl accused Peter of following Jesus. And again, he denies it. He responds by calling down curses on this little girl. And as soon as the words came out of his mouth, the rooster crows and Peter broke. Matthew tells us it went something like this. It was then that Peter remembered the word that Jesus had spoken, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And then Peter went outside and he wept bitterly. Luke tells us that it was at this moment that Jesus was also being led away. And as the rooster was crowing, and as Peter was making his final denial, Jesus and Peter made eye contact. And whenever Jesus looked at Peter, whenever Peter connected his eyes with Jesus, that's whenever Peter actually broke. Peter failed, and Peter knew it. He had denied Jesus, and I'm sure he had reasons for what he had done. Maybe he was afraid, Maybe he remembered that Jesus wasn't the first person to ever claim to be a Messiah, and all the other people who claimed to be a Messiah, whenever they were found out to be a false Messiah, like it didn't go well for their followers. And so maybe Peter was afraid that it wasn't going to go well for him either if he didn't distance himself. Maybe he just had this improper view of Jesus, Maybe he could not reconcile in his own mind how the Messiah, like the one who had all power, the one who had come to restore Israel, how could he be taken away and not even put up a fight? Like, how could he just surrender in that way? But Peter's first 2 denials were around being associated with Jesus. But his 3rd denial was of Jesus himself. And whenever Jesus looked at Peter, whenever their eyes connected, it was just more than what Peter could stand. I want to try and connect that to us a little bit this morning, because some of us are living our lives in denial of Jesus. Some of us are living lives that we know are so far from the life that Jesus would desire for us to live. And the way that we act, and the way that we prove that we love God, and the way that we love others, some of us don't love others well at all. Some of us are downright hateful. Some of us are prejudiced. Some of us have all kinds of failures. Maybe it's our ideologies that we deny Jesus in just the way that we view the world, Like we're living in this state of denial, our actions, our attitudes, whatever it may be. But I'm afraid that some of us, although we may be living in denial, and maybe we've denied 30 times, maybe we've denied 300 times, maybe we've denied 3,000 times, you can make that number as big as you want and it will probably still be true. But we're living in the middle of this denial, but we still haven't looked to Jesus. And the necessary brokenness that we must experience to receive the conviction of our sin, it requires that at some point we look to Jesus. Here, Peter, he makes eye contact with Jesus and he breaks. But we will not experience this necessary brokenness of our denials and our failures until we look at Jesus. But it was then that in Peter's denials and in his failures, we do not see Peter's story end there. And in our failures and in our denials, our story doesn't have to end there either. We know that Jesus would go on to be crucified, but thank God that wasn't the end, because 3 days later he would resurrect from the dead. And death would be defeated and hope would win. And as that very first Easter morning played out, we see where Jesus would go on to appear to multiple people. He would appear to some women. He would appear to a couple of guys on the road to Emmaus. And he would even appear to the disciples. And the Apostle Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 that it was around this time that Jesus even appeared to Peter for the first time. But we don't really know anything about that interaction. But we can feel this inside ourselves as Jesus is appearing to all the disciples after all that has happened. We want to know, how is Jesus going to respond to Peter? But we really don't get our answer until we go to John chapter 21. So if you have a Bible day, go ahead and open up to John chapter 21. And we're going to begin in verse 1 and go through a little bit of this chapter. Verse 1 begins like this. It says that afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples. So the death, burial, and resurrection has already taken place. And this is the third time now that Jesus has appeared to his disciples. And he appeared to them by the Sea of Galilee. And it happened in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, and Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples, they were together. And Peter said, I'm going out to fish. And they said, because they were probably good friends, I'm guessing Peter was still probably pretty blue and down on himself, and they didn't want Peter just to be out there by himself. And so they said, so we'll go with you. And so they all went out and got into the boat. But that night they caught nothing. So again, the resurrection has happened. They've already seen Jesus, but now Peter and some of the other disciples are out of the Sea of Galilee, and Peter decides that he wants to go fish. And the beauty of this story, the beauty of getting this story from John is that John is writing this story many years later. But you can still almost picture, as John is writing this smile that comes on his face as he's thinking back to this moment, because he knows exactly how this story is going to end. And you know that like you can feel the weight that Peter is feeling. This feeling of I've let someone down. We all know this feeling. We've let someone down, and we just want to make sure that things are good, but we haven't had the opportunity to make sure that things are good. And Peter's carrying all that around with him. He had promised Jesus. He had promised Jesus that he would never deny him. And even after Jesus telling Peter that he would, he still did. And so while Peter's trying to process all that has taken place, he goes back to what is so familiar. He goes back and he begins to fish. And perhaps he's replaying the events in his mind. Perhaps he's wondering if he's been disqualified from ministry. Perhaps he's wondering if he's messed up too much. At one point, Jesus said that on this rock, like Peter, like you're going to have a big role in building my church. Maybe Peter is wondering if that was still the case. But in his discouragement, in his failure, Peter goes back to the life that he left in order to follow Jesus. But as the night went on, things didn't go so well. In fact, these guys, they caught nothing. In verse 4, it says, early in the morning, Jesus, he stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. But he called out to them, friends, haven't you caught any fish? What a rude question. No, they answered. He said, then throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some fish. And when they did, they were unable to haul in the net because of the large number of fish. And there is something so beautiful and so intentional that is happening right here. Because if you go back to Luke chapter 5, you see the time whenever Jesus called Peter to be his disciple for the very first time. And in Luke chapter 5, Peter was fishing whenever Jesus called him to be his disciple. Peter had heard of Jesus and he knew a little bit about Jesus and he saw Jesus was on the shore. But as the night went on, Peter had caught absolutely nothing. And I think we might have to just consider that maybe Peter was just a really bad fisherman. But he had caught nothing, but as the night went on, he sees Jesus on the shore, and Jesus yells out to Peter, why don't you cast your net on the other side, right? And Peter casts his net on the other side, and he catches such a large number of fish that the net begins to break. And here you have this intentional callback. Jesus is telling Peter once again to cast his net out once more. And this time, Peter, he does not know that it is Jesus on the shore, but we can see this beautiful thing happening that should give us so much hope. Jesus is saying, Peter, in the midst of your guilt, in the midst of your shame, and in the midst of your failure, Peter, let's go back to the beginning. Because my calling for you, it still stands. Verse 7 tells us, then the disciple whom Jesus loved, which was John's nickname for himself, he said to Peter, it is the Lord. And I love these next three words. If you have a physical Bible, I'd even encourage you to underline these next three words. As soon as, like immediately, without a second thought, as soon as Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the water. And the other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, only about 100 yards or so. And when they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there, with fish on it and some bread. And it's right here that for the second and the final time in John's gospel, that he mentions there being a charcoal fire. The very first time was whenever Peter was standing around a charcoal fire calling down curses on a little girl while denying to be a follower of Jesus. Now Peter again stands around this fire as Jesus just stokes the charcoal. As Peter makes his way back to the shore after this miraculous catch of fish, there's this familiar feel. There's this familiar smell. And it's all there to take Peter back to the moment of his greatest failure. Because Jesus wanted to replace Peter's greatest moment of failure with great forgiveness. And church, he wants to do that with us as well. I love this quote by Richard Sibbes. He says that there is more mercy in Christ than there is sin in us. And verse 10 says that Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you have caught. So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, not 152 of them, not 154 of them, but 153. For whatever reason, John thought that was important to tell us. But even with so many fish, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. And none of the disciples, I love this, none of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? Because they knew that it was the Lord. And Jesus came and he took the bread and he gave it to them, and then he did the same with fish. And Jesus goes on to share this meal with them, which to the disciples and to Peter, they knew, because remember, all of them had fallen away on account of Jesus. They knew beyond any shadow of doubt that this was a very clear sign from Jesus to them, that Jesus still accepted them, that Jesus still aligned himself with them, that Jesus was still welcoming them, but Jesus wasn't done there. Because in verse 15 we read that when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, then feed my lambs. And again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Then Jesus said, then take care of my sheep. And then a third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? But Peter was hurt because Jesus had asked him the third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. You see, 3 questions to replace the 3 denials. As if Jesus is saying, yes, Peter, you failed. but I'm not through with you yet. There's still good work for you to do. And church, to you, Jesus is saying to each and every one of us today, yes, you failed. You have not lived the life that I've desired for you to live. You have chosen the way of the world over my way. But I'm not done with you yet. There's still good work for you to do. Church, the question is not, will you fail? Instead, the question is, how will you respond when you do? Will you grow or will you quit? Because in this exact same story, we find another guy who failed greatly. Judas Iscariot, he's the one who sold Jesus for the cost of a common slave. And like Peter, Judas had a moment in time whenever he realized the error of his ways. But he responded in a different way. When Judas, who had betrayed Jesus, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse, and he returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. Well, what is that to us? They replied. In other words, that's your problem. That's not our problem. That's your responsibility. And so Judas threw the money into the temple and he left. And then he went away and he hanged himself. Both of them failed. Both of them broke. One of them ran to Jesus. The other ran to their own demise. The question is not, will you fail? The question is, how will you respond when you do? Will you grow or will you quit? Church, I want you to see this, that in the middle of Peter's failure, in the middle of Peter's guilt, in the middle of Peter's regret, Jesus kept showing up again and again and again. And it's the same playbook that Jesus has for us today. In the middle of your failure, in the middle of your shame, and in the middle of your regret, Jesus continues to show up. And the experience that Peter had is an experience that we all must share. We all must have this realization that my failures don't keep Jesus away. But that when we believe that we've gone too far, that whenever we believe that we've just messed up too much, we cannot forget that Jesus continues to show up and inviting us to share breakfast with him on the beach. Because I can promise you, Jesus will continue to show up for you too. But church, it's still up to you to get out of the boat and to run to him. Will you pray with me this morning? Father in heaven, I thank you for the hope that we have in you, for the grace that we have in you, for the mercy that we experience in you. I thank you that you are a God who continues to show up again and again and again. And Father, I pray for each and every one of us that, Holy Spirit, you will convict us where we need to be convicted, that you will reveal to us the areas of our lives to where we are living with failure and regret, and that you will help us to surrender those things to you. So Jesus, I pray for our hearts that they will break where they need to break. I pray that we will turn our eyes to you, to see you, to be moved by you, to be drawn to you, to experience the grace and forgiveness that can only be found in you. Jesus, we love you. It's in your name we pray, amen. So we're going to